So what happens after death? Some people would say that there's nothing but the cold, dark abyss. While the Christian has in their mind, maybe there is something. Are atheists right? And it's nothingness? Or what does science say? And more importantly, what does the Bible say? Right, further every day. Howdy, Jonathan Gala here for Further Every Day in the chair of philosophy with Mr. Charlie. But to my right, I got the chair of theology. How are you?
Good morning. I am very good. How are you?
Doing well. So glad to have you there. Dealing with why we believe what we believe. Sitting in the chair here for philosophy, dealing with the rigor that the Christian must bring. But to my left, we are joined once again by a very special guest, Miss Anita Wood. How are you?
I am good, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
So glad to have you there. And today you're sitting in the chair of culture.
Is that right?
Yeah. So that's
yeah.
So by the way, that's why. So before we started, for those of you on audio, I apologize. Check out the YouTube, soon to be on X, I hope. But I actually moved the chair around. If you're wondering why this high back chair is now in this section, we moved it to culture, which I don't know if you realize. The reason we have a Oscar in the back is, yes, it's the chair of culture, but it wasn't an Oscar. It was the Golden Globe, but that's less iconic. Okay. Michelle Williams said I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my aborting my child. Right. So that,
it's
that's
just dumb.
Yeah, it is. It's sad, really. But
real sad.
Dealing with the culture that the world has brought and the counterculture the Christian must bring, kind of our answer to the culture. That's what that chair is for. And to her left, we got, as always, Mr. Steve. How's it going?
He's doing good, man. Going to step outside the box today and hopefully not float outside because that would die.
Well, maybe. Let's talk about that. We're going to talk about that.
It'd be cool. I felt like it.
So again, for those on audio, you don't really get to see Mr. Steve doing the robot every time I introduce him. I'm not sure what it's like. The robot box. He's making a robot box.
Yeah, it's because I'm politically incorrect and I'm going to step out.
Oh, that's what that is.
Box.
That makes more sense. I'm glad you explained it. To his left, we got Mr. Charlie, my co-host today. How's it going?
Greetings. It's good to have everybody here. I think this will be one of the more popular podcasts that we do. This is a big time topic.
Well, hey,
I agree with you,
I hope it is. He's sitting in the chair of economics in addition to the chair of co-host. He was the one that did a lot of the wrangling for today. So if you haven't seen the After Death movie yet, some of us in this room have not yet, partly because of scheduling, but whatever, but we're going to go see it. Go ahead and go watch it. It's from Angel Studios. It's an interesting, very, very interesting and important movie. I want to pull up some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. What, Steve?
Co-star here. After Death movie.
I wasn't Steve. You took away the thunder. You took away the thunder because she has her book here. I was going to say, and by the way, the cool thing about having Miss Anita Wood here is that she's actually written a book that is related because, actually, I don't want to take away from you.
Go ahead and we'll get to it when you get to it.
Okay. Because she was actually present at one of the events, and there's some very important testimony here that I think is very, very valuable. Yeah. But before we get there, Mr. Steve, Mr. Producer, if you can bring up my cut number 1, please. This is from the producers and researchers for the Angel Studios After Death movie. And I want to talk about first, what is death? Because people kind of have it's a bit of a moving goalpost. It's changed, and these gentlemen address it here, and I want to react to it afterward. But for now, Mr. Producer, they're going to be talking about what is death and how that is, how medically it's defined. Yep. I think that's an important thing to lay down right now. Go ahead, Ryan. And by the way, right, the producer guy in the producer's chair, thank you there for being there, sir. Go ahead and run that clip, please.
What does the cardiologist have to say about this, Dr. Saban?
about death?
Well, it's not a softball question, I can tell you that. I agree with what Dr. Long said. He said it perfectly. The thing that interests me is that I do believe that the out-of-body experience is a manifestation of the human soul. And I had thought that, well, the soul leaves the body when the body is dead. And so I did some research on that, and especially in the New Testament also, Paul's experience in 2 Corinthians 12, where he said he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows. Then he went to the third heaven and was told whatever he heard or saw up there, it was unlawful for him to communicate. So to me, that struck me as maybe he had some type of out-of-body experience and really couldn't explain it. And that's very common in these experiences. People say, I don't know what happened to me, but this is what happened. And so anyway, I reviewed the literature, the theological literature for the last 150 years. And I came across 5 or 6 very well-known theologians who had weighed in on this. And they said that it's entirely possible that the soul can actually leave the body prior to final physical death. So that did fit with what was going on with these near-death experiences. That said, I believe that that final physical death happens, and I think it's irreversible, and it also is when the soul completely leaves the body. I don't think the soul is totally separate from the body until final physical death. So bottom line is that I think the near-death experience is a spiritual experience in the spiritual realm of the soul separating, but not separated entirely from the physical body.
I love that story. Sorry to interrupt, Jason, but I love that story from the Bible because...
So in the story they're talking about is Paul 14 years before he's writing this letter. And so I think that's important, but let's go ahead and lay out what clinical death is. So clinical death is that moment where the heart has stopped beating. And that's how we typically have defined death up until this point. One of the things that's really interesting about this whole body of study, pardon the pun, is that we're actually starting to understand that the brain, and more importantly, there's something else, we would call that the soul, is still active after that cardiac arrest, even during anesthesia, which I think they'll cover in a little bit, which is something that I think it's very telling. Again, I forget the name of the philosopher, but he said there'll come a day when all the scientists and all of the philosophers will climb a mountain, and when they reach the zenith of the mountain of knowledge, they'll find theologians having sat there for ages before.
Wow.
And so that's kind of where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm.
Where does everyone in this room think that, up until, say, you started to look into it, starting off, where did you think death was? When do you think you died? Like biologically, where'd you put a mark and say that person is dead?
That's really interesting because I remember probably 12 or 13. And my aunt was in a serious car accident, and she had one of these experiences. So I was exposed at a very young age. So I've always been very open to these near-death experiences. To say somebody is they're just not going to be revived. I don't think there is a moment, because it's been proven that they have clinically determined someone to be dead, and all of a sudden they wake up. I mean, you don't have to go far. Yeah, it's not uncommon to hear that. So I don't think you can pinpoint a moment. I think you need to just, they're gone. There's no life. You have to wait, I guess.
So
what I'm just trying to say, making it very confusing, I don't know if we have that very moment now.
And we're going to explore that today. Excuse me, get something in my throat. I think that there's a extra natural explanation. See, because everyone in this room, I believe, would would identify as a dualist. And what I mean by that is that there is a physical and a metaphysical. And there's two components to the body. The question comes, if there is a metaphysical, when that separation from this earth has occurred, that is when death actually occurs, where I think we would actually define it. But like you, my father actually had 2 out-of-body near-death experiences, NDEs, as they call them. Anyway, my father's had 2, and one of them was very, very clear. In fact, if you look at his face, you can actually see where the ice skate went right through here. He was ice skating. 2 girls were running, and one actually bumped him, and the other one tried to jump over him. She didn't quite make it. Oh. He was holding his Bible in his hand in the back of his car. Someone was driving him to the ER, and he had lock limb syndrome, holding on to the Bible. They pulled him in 48 minutes after they signed the death certificate. He was in the morgue, and they were in the elevator getting ready to put him on the slab. And they heard a Meanwhile, he had been talking with Jesus without using words so much. And there was a question of, what would you like? Do you want to stay here, or do you want to go back? And his answer was, what would please you? And then the light at the end of the tunnel that had gotten brighter, got dimmer into the back, and he woke up and heard the and the morgue technician said, "We got a live one." So
I'm sure that freaked him out.
I believe, we both have, I think a lot of us in here have those. Miss Anita would, for sure, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. But when did you first start to think that there might be something other than cardiac arrest for death? Like there might be a point further along?
I don't know that I really have contemplated that particularly.
That's a fair response.
I'm not a person to seek out and hypothesize too much. But I have seen things that I just accept. More and more now, and especially with my personal exposure to some of the people involved in the After Death movie, and Dr. Sabom in particular, and different others, I think it's hard to determine, like Nikki mentioned, and like you mentioned with your dad. I'm thinking of sort of quote from Dr. Sabom, I think, in the movie, the people who actually die don't come back. Lazarus and Jesus, the only ones that we know of with certainty. But people don't die forever and come back. What we have in the in-between that all of us are talking about are near-death experiences. There's something, not full death, but something that we really don't understand clearly. We're just beginning to say it does happen. And the one I'm personally involved with, I don't know how you can refute someone's count, like your dad's. I'm not here to say that didn't happen. And that's kind of where I stand with it.
Yeah. Steve, where did you think that death was pronounced before you started looking into this?
Before I started looking into it, was when they declared you dead.
Yeah, science.
Science
at the scientific consensus.
Sure. My father died of cancer, I think it was 15 years ago. And they declared him dead. And, me, that was just dead. And of course, he didn't ever come back. He died of pancreatic cancer. And I have personally never experienced or personally talked to anybody that has had an out-of-body experience, but the only person that I've ever talked to about that real sort of thing was Anita. And I guess it's probably been a couple of years I talked to her and her husband about experience of a book that we kind of got in depth about it and talked about her former husband that had passed away and what he had done and whatnot. And it was just mind blowing what it was that they had talked about. And I was just amazed.
Yeah.
And
Brother Charlie.
You know, I don't know as I've had a specific time that I really started delving into that deeply. I do want to bring up something that's really interesting from the perspective of Jewish culture. You know, when you think about Lazarus being in the tomb 3 days, Mary and Martha were not happy campers. Why? Because Jesus was only a couple hours away and was close by when it come to go get Jesus, he can heal him. Why did Jesus wait 3 days?
Yep.
And the reason being is that in Jewish culture, you weren't dead unless you were dead for 3 days.
And that has to do with coma, without life support.
Yeah.
That has to do, but now we know.
Yeah.
Now we know.
Absolutely. And the reason I bring that up is when you get to the issue of Jesus being in the grave.
Yes.
Hello. You know, you can't refute somebody being dead for 3 days. So I find that to be really interesting. I do agree with Nikki. I'm not sure that we can pinpoint a moment. We can say cardiac arrest. Well, okay. When CPR came along, guess what? We've had a lot of people come back from the dead.
Yeah, and let's explore that for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's explore that for a moment, because 10 minutes is called biological death. And the reason for that, for example, during drowning, did you know that most people, their trachea valve closes during drowning? And it doesn't open until 20 minutes. And there's a 10-minute lapse, and there are reasons for that. But the trachea valve closes and doesn't start to reopen until 20 minutes after the person's heart stopped beating. So they'll take the gulp of water, their trachea valve closes to prevent the lungs from filling as much as possible, and that valve will be shut. By the way, that's why you don't have to do a bunch of diaphragmatic thrust. We used to call it the Heimlich. We can't call it that anymore because we can't have nice things because people didn't do it right. And they killed people with Heimlich. Anyway. But people say, do I do the Heimlich or do I do diaphragmatic thrust to get all that stuff out? It's like, no. Squeeze them once, start CPR. But wear a barrier, because in a retrospective study out of Australia, 10 years, they looked back over the last 10 years and looked at what happened. 2/3 of those who received rescue breaths, which is what you start with when you're doing water, drowning CPR. And then 86% of those who went on to have rescue breaths and compressions vomited, usually in the rescuer's mouth when they were going for the breath. Mm-hmm. So, because all of that is shut up here. Why do I bring that up? You ever wonder why the coroner is able to reliably say the person was dead 3 hours before they were found, or 24 hours before they were found? During the biological death phase, which is just a fancy word for saying the body is returning to dust, things like that trachea valve, they'll open at a slow, steady, measurable, reliable decay rate. That's how the coroner is able to measure. They take a measurement, they come back, take another measurement, and they say, okay, this is the time that the person passed. And you can get it down to within minutes. So all of that to say, within 10 minutes, there is a physical decay that starts.
Real death.
With real death. There is a physical decay that does start. And there are people who have suffered from some of that decay and then they come back, which again, that leads me to clip number 2, my clip number 2, if you can pull it up. That leads me to believe that there's something else at play here. And I think some of these stories, so scientifically, we believe in the Bible as the foundation of our revelation, our understanding, and our belief. Any science that contradicts the Bible is a misobservation. Somehow we have misobserved, or we do not understand the evidence that we are purporting to understand. But I do think that science is incredibly valuable. It's incredibly valuable. And so we're going to tee this up. And, Steve teased it earlier. Miss Anita has some incredible testimony. And actually, she's written a book about it. And I want to talk about that in a moment. But what they talk about here, I think, directly links to the testimony that she's about to give us. There's something else at work. Go ahead and play that cut, Mr. Producer.
Chapter 14, where it says that Paul was stoned to death in Lystra and dragged out of the city and left for dead. And then in 2 Corinthians 12, which Dr. Sabum is talking about, he says, 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, but I was taken up into heaven and I saw and heard things inexpressible, things that, people are not allowed to tell. And if you look at a lot of the things that Paul writes, it's amazing how they correlate with the commonalities of what people who've had near-death experiences say. There are a lot. There are about 40 of them that I chronicle in Imagine Heaven. But one of them, and Dr. Long has noted this, and by the way, Dr. Long has assimilated over 5,000 near-death experiences from all over the world in his research foundation and studied them and even looked at the percentages. And I believe, you can speak into this, Jeff, but 34% say they come to a border or a boundary in their near-death experience that they knew they could not cross and still come back to life. And the reason that's important is that from a spiritual perspective, I think, for me anyway, what death is also evolving. Because in some cases, I've had near-death experiencers that I've interviewed tell me that Jesus told them, you haven't died yet, you have to go back. And yet they were clearly clinically dead. They had no brain waves. And we're talking some of them for like an hour and 45 minutes. So not just a few seconds. And so from our clinical view of death, there were no brain waves. And yet they were fully alive in their soul, in their spirit. And I think that border or boundary is the crossing over into eternity. So that's that separation from clinical death to full biological death, like Dr. Sabin was talking about. And one other thing, I think that's really important spiritually as well, because, and you'll see this in the film, people like, some of my good friends now, Professor Howard Storm, who he was an atheist when he died, is having a hellish experience and yet cries out to God for forgiveness and is rescued. And there are actually 3 guys in the film, all of them, by the way, are now pastors today, who cried out to God in this experience and were rescued by him. And that always bothered me because, does this mean that after death, then we can still cry out to God? But I think that border or boundary marks a differentiation between still a tie to this earthly life and entering into eternity. And I don't know exactly what that means, except I think the Bible talks about it, that it's appointed for mankind to die once, and then comes judgment. And that's Hebrews 9:27. And so I think that's after that crossing over that border or boundary.
Okay. So, Miss Anita, I'd like you to share your experience, because you actually have a kind of a tie to this movie and some of the stories that are in it, don't you?
Well, I have a tie with Don Piper's story. And he's the one who wrote 90 Minutes in Heaven and has just been a worldwide bestseller. And I was on the bridge with him that day when the accident happened. So some of the other people that were there may still be alive, but I'm the one who knows exactly what happened to him in his wreck.
Can you tell us, so back up, some people aren't going to know who Piper is. Back up just a little bit and tell us the whole story from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, my husband, who is deceased now, was a pastor, and we were at a conference in East Texas. And funny enough, someone there decided to serve a bunch of pastors decaf coffee, which gave me a headache. And I even had to drink a Dr. Pepper to get over my headache. So when we left there on a Wednesday morning, it was rainy and bad weather, but we were heading back toward the Houston area, and Dick and I pulled into Dairy Queen to get me a cup of coffee. Because of that, when we came to this narrow 2-lane bridge, we were the first car upon the accident. There were no police, no EMS, no nothing but us driving across a bridge. And my husband told, but later wrote, his account of it for our congregation in the mid-'80s, way before any other written account was ever done about this accident. So if I can read what he wrote, if you like.
I would love that.
He talks about being the first car. He said, when I see accidents, I typically stop to offer aid, and today was no different. As we approached the smashed car, I identified it as a Ford Escort. I realized the accident had occurred only minutes before we appeared. We were the first to arrive on the scene. I saw the horrific carnage of the Ford Escort and suggested Anita walk back toward the less damaged car, the first car we passed on the bridge. That driver was conscious. The only other person on the bridge at the time was the prison guard who had been a passenger in the 18-wheeler truck. He walked toward me and said, "Don't bother about the man over there," pointing to the crushed car. "I've already checked on him. There's nothing to do. He's already dead." He continued with details about the driver losing control of the truck. We were entering the bridge, driving down the steep slope, and a slow-moving car pulled out in front of us. My driver swerved because he wanted to miss the car, but that made our truck go out of control. We began to veer side by side. He pointed to the east end of the bridge. He finally regained control and stopped there. After listening to the guard's account, I still felt I should go to see myself about the injured man. I walked toward the smashed car and stood beside the driver's door. That's when I saw a piece of bone lying on the highway. It must have belonged to the man in the car. I tried to process what I saw. His body was twisted and mangled and lifeless. I wanted to know for sure. I wanted to verify for myself whether he was dead or alive. So I felt for a pulse, and there was none. Urgency arose in my heart, an urgency to pray. I recognized God's pressing on my spirit, and his message was clear and succinct. Pray for the dead man. The words he gave me were few but specific. He impressed on me to pray 2 things, that the man live and that he have no internal injuries. I didn't discuss God's urging or direction with anyone, and of course I knew such a prayer made no sense. Yet God's instruction to me was clear. I didn't know anyone who would dare pray such words, so still I hesitated. Should I? Have I just gone nuts? Why would anybody pray such a prayer? Why would I pray these things when I already was told the man was dead? I can't even find a pulse, yet the urgency persisted. I tried to think, to understand, to decide what to do. Enough time had passed that police officers and emergency medical units arrived. I watched an officer approach the crushed car. He, too, attempted to find a pulse on the mangled man. I overheard his call on his radio. "We have one fatality here." I remained near the small crushed car and watched an EMS declare the man was a fatality. 4 different people now had verified the man was indeed dead. First the prison guard, then me, next the police officer, and finally the EMT. Still, I could not dismiss the impulse to pray. God had not released me from his resolve. The Spirit continued to compel me to pray specifically for this man. Finally, I obeyed as directed. Determined, I stepped toward the wreckage again and reached inside the shattered driver's side window. I extended my right arm and shoulder into the car as far as I could, and then I prayed, and I prayed boldly. I prayed aloud, willing for anyone nearby to join in the prayer. Once I prayed, I suppose the next thing I should do was speak to the man. After all, I reasoned, if God led me to pray so specifically, then I should expect some result. My first words to this lifeless, unrecognizable man were, "Friend, it's very important that I ask you this. Are you a born-again Christian?" He responded, "I'm a preacher." He even told me which church he served in Alvin, Texas. That's when I realized we had attended the same meeting for the past few days. I was startled to identify this was Don. Before now, I couldn't tell who he was due to his injuries and condition. I began singing to encourage him to stay conscious. As I waited for an ambulance, I sang all the hymns I could recall, beginning with, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And when I sang, Don began to sing along. His voice was weak, but his voice clearly joined mine in singing praises to God. And then the ambulance came and they took him. And when Dick and I left the scene, there was a very steep hill going west at that point. We drove up the hill to the first payphone, called his church in Alvin, and that's how they learned that there had been an accident.
Wow. So, again, his testimony and story are in the movie. So
Right.
go and watch that. But I thought it would be really, really important. By the way, where can people find this book?
I haven't looked recently. You may be able to find it on Amazon. It was there. But if not, contact me and we'll see what we can do.
Leave us a question mark in one of the comment sections. And if you see it, do
do a
it
Google
on YouTube
search.
or YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazon may have it.
What's the name of you need to give the name of the book?
Divine Appointment, Our Journey to the Bridge.
So all of that to say, we weren't here necessarily to
Hold
sell
that
a
up
book,
again,
but I want
Anita.
to give people the knowledge of where to
There you
go. So that's an important part of the story, I believe. Let me see. I think I know what happened here. Pardon me. Technical difficulties here. That's an important part of the story, and I think people need to realize something. They talk about this in the behind the scenes. I thought they mentioned it. They may or may not have in the clip that we pulled. One of the commonalities in a lot of these stories is that there's someone intercessing in the room with the patient on the bed or on the side of the road. That is a commonality. That is something that is really, really interesting. I want to get some reactions around the room to the idea that there is a spiritual boundary that some of these people seem to detect or at least instinctually realize that they cannot cross if they want to move into the next world. Does anyone have any level reactions to that you want to share?
Well, I share with you that my aunt had one of these experiences. Well, this is the interesting thing is my aunt, I'm probably 12 or 13 at the time. And when I was 11, her son was 6 years old and died of leukemia. And that was her only child. And she was a single mother. So she I don't know if she was a believer or not a believer. Okay. She wasn't living a very righteous life at that time. And she had the accident, and in her experience, she was walking toward heaven, and her son was sitting on Jesus' lap. And when Jesus looked at her, told her, "Go back." So that was all that's all that I remember and had, but she saw her son with Christ. So, like I said, I've always been a person that has believed in this. And I always believe that just because we can't explain it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because God is so powerful and our minds are so simple. There are things probably right before us that we don't see and understand because God has not revealed it to us. So this is not hard for me to understand when I hear these things.
So, by the way, I'm about to say something that's going to be a little bit controversial. Okay, I'm going to say something that's a bit controversial, and some of you, we're going to have a diversity of opinion here. I almost guarantee. This one pastor that I know, I actually don't fully agree with him, but I mostly agree with him. And he said, I'm not a universalist. He said, I'm a mostalist. And what he meant by that is that in that moment between this world and that there are probably a lot of souls that are redeemed in those last moments, that there's the opportunity for that. I'm very cautious of taking that on, but I do agree with him that there are a lot of people. There are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are atheists, there are Baptists, there are Catholics who are not saved when they die. And in that moment, they become saved. The reason I know that is because some of these people come out of the near-death experience believing in God. And a lot of them experience Jesus, or they talk to Christ himself, like my father did. So does that mean that we should be less evangelistic? No.
Oh.
Evangelism, I'm going to say this, and some people aren't going to like this, okay? Evangelism is for your relationship with Christ. God doesn't need you to save lives. God wants you to be about saving souls because he wants you to be like him. He literally sacrificed his son. He wants you to be about evangelism the way that he is, and part of making us more like him. He does not need you to save souls.
I think the other thing that we need to remember here too, for those that are listening that maybe are not believers, this is not fire to play with.
Oh, absolutely.
I think on the flip side of that, and I hear totally there, and I don't know as I disagree with any of that. I think it's also equally dangerous to play that kind of game with God. God is not a player of games. And I think it would be very dangerous for a person to assume that they could be a participant in that kind of a scenario. I think the reason that we see and hear about these near-death experiences, I would say, and I would love to hear Miss Anita say something in regards to this. I think we're so close to the end times that I think this is one of those avenues that God may be using for people to really consider their walk with God. Because I know back in the 70s, there were probably these kind of stories. They were not popular.
Let me push back on that.
Sure.
Let me push back on that. The knowledge in the end times will increase. I think we're starting to see with the social media age, people are, for example, Israel and Gaza right now. People are seeing war in all of its unbridled brutality. Yes, Israelis are bombing military targets that are built over apartment buildings,
civilian
and
areas.
There are children who are broken and dead, and you see that. So people have a different opinion of war than they used to. It's not that the Spartans were somehow who glorified war. Be clear. It's not like they were somehow like war was less brutal. If anything, it was more so. So now we get to see war crimes live in real time. We get to see civilian casualties live in real time. Now we get to see near-death experiences. They're a minority.
Well, in the movie, Dr. Savon talks a lot about, he interviews people, and he's interviewed people for 40 plus years as he began his personal research. And many people say to him, "You're the first person I've spoken to this about." So yes, I think it happened, but people didn't speak about it because you were thought to be crazy.
Yeah.
But also another doctor testified that with heart resuscitation that's more active and available today, then you're having more of these.
Yeah, but the one thing that I have to stress, and I just said it, and that this is what I was stressing when you said that, you don't stop evangelizing because of news like this.
Totally.
Oh, no.
You
No, no,
can't.
no.
Totally
You
agree.
can't, because God wants you to take part in that act.
Yeah.
And that is an act of obedience. And it should be urgent to you.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. There is a time of free will and choice. I believe that anyone and everyone could hypothetically be convinced to that. Not everyone will, because they've decided that and they've made a choice. So there's this weird thing of God's sovereignty and free will. The one thing I can say with assurance, and I know this because of God's character, because of his nature, and because of the scientific evidence we have before us, there will be 0 souls in hell saying, I desire God and I wish that he would have given me a better chance. I wish he would have given me a better life, so I would have picked him.
I think that's an excellent point right there. And it kind of ties in with what some pastors and theologians will say. If you're in hell, it's because you chose that. You chose that. And if you really think about the starkness of that statement, are there people like that today? Yes.
Then they're down there cursing God.
Yeah.
There will be 0 people. Everyone in hell will want out.
Yeah.
Noted. Like the rich man wanted out.
Yes.
He wanted relief. But did he ever say, God, Abraham, go to God and tell him? No, he says, Abraham, go to my relatives, go to my brothers and tell them that they may not come to this place, because I am, there was a moral superiority to the rich man. But he never said, forgive me, get me out of here. I want God. He never said that. It's Nikki.
Well, I was going to, I listened to a podcast about a man who survived. He was on a hike. He got lost for 5 days. He didn't have any water. He had a vision or an encounter, and he said Jesus came, and he saw Jesus in he was very powerful, and he knew it was Jesus, and he knew he was powerful. And this is what he said on the podcast: but I'm not going to convert to Christianity. I decided at that moment I was going to embrace my Jewish faith. God always comes to you and gives you a choice. My word will not return void. 2 things are going to happen. You're going to soften to the word, or you're going to harden to the word. So you are making a choice with the information that God has given to you.
You'll be one of the Jewish people that are left behind.
Well, and again, this brings me to, and again, this is kind of, I don't want to get too off in the weeds in this, but I do believe that God, you have 2 reactions to God. Your heart, when it says in the Bible that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, God can't do evil. It's not in the nature of God. God revealed himself to Pharaoh, and in reaction to that was hardening Pharaoh's heart. God revealed himself to Pharaoh, and he said, I am God. This is real. I am real. And Pharaoh had a reaction. You have a reaction when you encounter God.
Yes.
It's either a hardening or a softening, and it is based on the makeup. And in that way, you're predestined. Only in that way. And that God, when he made you, knew what you would do, but God still gives you the choice.
John Arthur, I think one of the things for our listeners or those that are viewing this, the clips that we're playing were from the recorded live stream with 3 different people, and the 5, sorry, that live stream contains a lot of compelling information that I think they would benefit from hearing.
Link in the description below.
Absolutely. I will say that before even seeing anything about this, a few years ago I was watching something on TV, and I don't know if it was one of those documentary type series where they deal with certain things. This one happened to be after death experiences. And this one woman was very, very ill, very sick, and dying in her bed at home. And somebody had called the ambulance. Ambulance came, and she was one of those that described this floating out of the body and seeing things from up above. She was describing things that she would have had no way of knowing. And those are the kind of things that are very interesting, very compelling to listen to. And the recorded live stream is something that, if you're not sure about really going and seeing the movie, I would encourage you to listen to the live stream first.
Can I add something here? And you're talking about floating out of your body. There are a couple people that we know personally, one of them being Charlie's Aunt Karen. Here in Luke chapter 16 and 19 through 29, and it says, the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. So when Aunt Karen died in her sleep, in her bed, her arms were like this. She was reaching up. Angels were reaching down to grab Aunt Karen. She was reaching up. There was another woman at our church. She died in her sleep, and that's how they found her. I have no doubt. I don't doubt that for a minute.
So one of my Bible study teachers, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, real quick, just to back on that.
Go ahead.
We know of a man in our church previously in Lakeland, Florida, served many years, children's ministry, bus ministry, and he was in a hospital, had family and friends around, and when he passed, it was described, hands went up, smile was on the face, and hands came down.
Yeah. One of my Bible study teachers, when she passed, when her mom passed, rather, she said, "Don't you see that man? Don't you see that man? He's beckoning me, and he wants me to cross the river with him." So there's a geophysical, but I say geospiritual boundary, rather, that you are invited across. And so I think that's something that's really important to note, that this is beyond simply spirit. We've taken the metaphysical. I think we've taken the metaphysical and we have crossed it into the scientific based on multiple users' experiences, or individual experiences. People who's there's a techie in me. Multiple people who I build websites and do online work. So people's experiences, and we're actually translating all of this data into something that is a body of evidence. But most people don't believe in that evidence. Mr. Charlie, I know you wanted to cover kind of what the culture and what the world thinks about this. There's some good Barna data, Mr. Producer. If you could pull that up, it's going to be the Barna note. It's not going to be a cut. It's going to be the Barna note.
Yeah, and in the Barna Research, when it comes to spiritual related things, probably one of the best organizations that you could find on research. I will note, this is really important to note here. This study was done back in the early 2000s.
Noted.
So the statistics and everything that you see in there are a little old, but compared to what we're used to today.
You have those stats in front of you?
I don't.
So, okay.
Go ahead.
Real quick. How many people believe in the afterlife? Well, 81% polled believe that there was some sort of afterlife. Another 9% said life after death may exist, but they were not certain. Just 1 out of 10 adults contend that there's no form of life after one dies after Earth. That has changed.
A lot.
That has changed, but again, this is an older study. However, heaven and hell. The survey explored people's views on heaven and hell. In all, 76% believed that heaven existed, while nearly the same proportion said that there is such a thing as hell. So 71%. Respondents were given various descriptions of heaven and asked to choose a statement that best fit their belief. Those who believe in heaven were divided between describing heaven as a state of eternal existence with God in his presence and those who said it is an actual place of rest and reward where souls go for after death. 46-30% split. Other Americans claim that heaven is just symbolic, 14%, and that there's no such thing as life after death, 5%, or that they're unsure, 5%.
And I would say those numbers have probably gone up over the last 20 years.
They've shifted, for sure. While there's no dominant view of hell, two particular perspectives are popular. 4 out of 10 adults believe that hell is a state of eternal separation from God's presence. I would disagree with that. I think it's an eternity in the presence of God, and we can discuss that at some time. We need to do a full debate.
Podcast. Charlie disagrees with John Arthur.
Charlie's wrong. I would agree with you, but then I'd be wrong too. But
it's a fun topic to discuss.
But with that said, eternal separation from God, 39%, and 1/3 says that it's an actual place of torment and suffering where people's souls go after death. That is much closer to what I believe. And Charlie would take more of the 39% view.
Yeah.
However, I would say that it's actually the presence of God that is the torment of the soul, the righteousness of God, the presence of His righteousness.
To that, the one thing that I would say in regards to this research, the study, and where we're at today in culture, is what's sad to me is the number of quote unquote Christians who don't believe in a heaven or hell.
And that's actually gone up.
What?
Yeah.
How can that even be possible?
Well, and here's the thing. I know. I totally agree with that question right there. I think, though, that there are a lot of people who claim to be Christian. They really have no idea who Christ is. So you've gotten some skewed data, opinion, whatever. That's what I think. The reason I want to bring this up is this. You, dear listener, you, dear viewer, you need to come to this conclusion on your own. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to give you some things to consider, to think about. We come at it from what we believe is a strong biblical viewpoint. And today's podcast is no different. So I think it's really important that everybody understand, don't just listen to someone. You don't just listen to a pastor tell you this is true without checking it out. You don't listen to your friend just tell you this is true without you checking it out. There was something that came through on Facebook the other day, and what does Charlie do? I'm like, better check this out. This looks a little funny. Well, funny enough, I had checked it out just a couple days before, and he said, I'm going to let the fact checkers check it. And I gladly responded. So all of that to say, we need to study. We need to dig. That's up to us individually.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to update those stats, a 2021 as opposed to 2000s poll suggests that 61% of Americans believe that there is a heaven and a hell.
Wow.
Only 61%.
Wow.
So what that means is we got 40% walking around that believes that there's only a hell or only a heaven. And that would be 13% only believing in heaven. And there is a 1% that believes not in a heaven, but only in a hell. So link in the description below. By the way, this is from Pew Research. I just pulled it up, so I'll have to put it in the thing. I'm not going to torture Mr. Producer here. But just a note, only 92% of Christians believe in a heaven. Those 8% of Christians, so-called, do not. And by the way, it's only 79% of Christians believe in a hell. So all that to say, biblical literacy, very important. Mm-hmm. But if you do not believe in a heaven or a hell, and you are a Christian, and you are listening to the sound of our voices on this podcast, I humbly suggest, get your butt up, go watch this movie. But also, more importantly, what does the Bible mean to you?
Read your Bible.
Boy, what
does the Bible mean to you?
I think we need to make it clear. There's a lot of people that Many people label themselves as a Christian, but they have no clue who Jesus Christ is and have never made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ.
Jesus is mostly unicorn, lollipop,
Yes.
rainbows.
Yes. As one woman said to me, well, you're a Christian. You're born in a Christian nation. So,
Yeah. And so, yeah, that I eat at Chick-fil-A. I'm a Christian sort of problem. It's just not wrong.
Don't tell me that.
What are you saying, Ryan?
Holy. Don't do that.
Yeah. So Ryan works at Chick-fil-A as well. As volunteering for this podcast, he's also a hardworking Chick-fil-A guy. Go annoy him in the drive-thru and ask for extra everything. Yeah, he's looking for his. Okay, he found it. But all of that to say, I think that we've put together a somewhat compelling list here, and this podcast is going to go a little bit long because we do want to actually do this justice, and we kind of want to get into that. Is everyone okay with this kind of spilling into a kind of a second part here? Yeah. Okay.
yeah, Steve hasn't even got to talk yet, so.
I want Steve to talk.
He hasn't had a chance to get politically incorrect.